English translation, 313th contact, Sunday 14th October 2001, 22:46 hours.
Hello, dear friend Eduard, here I am.
You got here fast. It has not been 2 minutes since you signaled. Natan also just left half a minute ago.
I only waited for that after I gave him the appropriate impulses, since we cannot go into your workroom because Ava is in it.
You could have put her into a deep sleep.
There was no need for that because it is comfortable here in your living room. I see you brought the material for us as well.
Right. Here, take it right away. Do you have more work for me?
It is only little this time.
Also good. By the way, are you interested in the symbols of the spiritual teaching?
Of course. We also have a considerable archive in this regard.
Aha, then I could have saved myself the 30-hour effort.
What do you mean?
Well, I retrieved about 100 spirit teaching symbols from the memory banks, which I painstakingly recorded, after which Bernadette worked them out, which means at least half by tonight.
Then you both have done a great job. But you were right to retrieve the symbols from the memory banks.
I think so too. Then no one can say the roast is being served to me on a plate.
That was the meaning of my words.
Good. Then something else. I am constantly being approached in relation to the madness of terrorism, and indeed, also in relation to the terrorism that the attackers are carrying out in Afghanistan, calling it a just retaliation, which I consider a blasphemy against humanity, because the counterterrorism that is taking place will once again kill countless innocent human beings, quite apart from the fact that the entire Islamic world will be thrown into turmoil, which will lead to new acts of hatred, retaliation, and terror, if not to the Third World War, which may well be the ultimate outcome of the vengeful counterterrorism. It does not change the fact that the attackers are dropping food parcels from aircraft for the suffering and starving Afghanis, and are also transporting food. Because I believe that all this is only a flimsy attempt to change the minds of those Afghanis against the Taliban who can seize the food dropped. A flimsy attempt to make the Afghan people pro-American. An approach which, under the guise of humanity, is therefore a role of calculating meanness, and shows an unprecedented lack of character. Just think, on the one hand, food is thrown away and food is transported, and on the other, the same people who are supposed to benefit from this are harassed and murdered by rockets and bombs. Rockets, bombs, and other lethal means, as well as hatred, retaliation, revenge, and terrorism or counterterrorism never eradicate injustice, murder, manslaughter, terror, and Gewalt, figudict, to use, with all the coercive means that are at one's disposal, physical, psychical, mental, and consciousness-based powers, abilities and skills, in order to carry out and carry through terrible actions and deeds, but so also not suffering and mourning, but new suffering, tears, murders, new injustice, new Gewalt, and new terror arise from it.
These are words that correspond to my meaning. But there will be only few people who recognize these facts, and therefore think in a reasonable wise.
I realize that. But I would like best to publish what I have said on the internet. What is your opinion?
The thought is good, but you have to be aware that you will create more enemies than friends, because the real truth does not want to be heard. Besides, many humans are afraid of the stronger ones and their secret services and their influence and power, so they agree with them, even though they may have doubts about it. However, their cowardice is stronger than their reason.
Back when communism was powerful, they used to say, "Better red than dead." But today, when Americans are the real great power on the earth, the motto is, if you do not want to be America's brother, then they will smash your skull in.
That is aptly put, but your words are dangerous.
I know, but I stand by it. And if I should be killed by another assassination attempt, then it should be clear where those responsible will be. But let us leave that for now, because I have another question about Silvano.
I wanted to talk to you about that as well, but it should be in a separate form. I already know the facts of the case.
All right, so be it. Do you want to talk about it right now, or can I ask 2 more questions?
My time is limited today, so I want to give my opinion on the matter.
Your wish is my command. Then get on with it.
I will be brief, then maybe there is time for your 2 questions. So hear what I have to say.
Thank you for your comments, which are really clear. I guess that is all there is to it. Is there enough for my questions now?
Certainly. I know about the incident, and actually it is the reality that the passenger plane was accidentally shot down with a rocket by the Ukrainian army.
There you go. Then the second question. During your last visit, you did not express your opinion about the cause of terror in relation to the attack in the USA on the 11th of September. You only said that the Americans were once presented with a bill, so to speak, because they interfere in foreign affairs all over the world. But what do you think about the terrorist elements? What I think about that, I wrote in Bulletin number 36. I do not think it is right that terror is punished by counterterrorism, and that innocent people are murdered in the process. And it is clearly murder when terror or counterterrorism causes innocent people to lose their lives.
Read his question.
First of all, I would like to ask you not to officially mention my address and the country of my residence, whereas I have no objection to mentioning my name. My denomination is Jewish, but I still cannot understand what my fellow believers in Israel are doing against the Arabs, using terrorist acts of the worst kind, and therefore unscrupulous killing, which is also being done by the Arabs against the Israeli people. I cannot agree with this, which is why I am concerned about what could be done to stop the mutual hatred between the 2 peoples and to create peace. Can you, Mr. Billy Eduard A. Meyer, give us some decisive advice? I am increasingly ashamed of being human and Jewish. Shimon Nusseibeh.
Answer.
I am not interested in politics, because my task is not to be a mediator between peoples who want to exterminate each other for religious and other idiotic reasons and who, in their hatred and fanaticism, breed their infants into killing machines, do not listen to any sensible advice and prefer to kill and play warriors as a lucrative and decent work, which also refers to all those armed men and women who believe that they must defend or reclaim their country. Instead of creating true peace and freedom through reason and love, in the form of a full and lasting coexistence truly worthy of humanity. But the blinded ones, fools, idiots, killers, fanatics and power-hungry, etc., can hardly be brought to such an action, because their minds are not sufficient to grasp real reason, to recognize what is right, to put aside their self-importance and lust for power, as well as their roaring hatred and blazing fanaticism, and to begin to think clearly and humanely. But this is not enough, because the intelligence leaves so much to be desired that a reasonable thought and a reasonable feeling resulting from it cannot gain a foothold. So primitiveness, in the worst sense of the word, prevails, and this can never be surpassed by reason, because the necessary intelligence is lacking. There is nothing to be advised in this respect. Therefore, as far as the question of good advice is concerned, for he or she who is not capable of rational thought cannot be taught better by reason and logic. So all that remains is for all murderous and irrational idiots to slaughter and ultimately exterminate each other, regardless of whether they are creatures from the criminal scene or human beings from states who believe that they have a right to murder and terrorism, which they then call self-defense or state defense, and which is then advocated and therefore approved of by like-minded people from other groups or states. That is my opinion and my experience, which I have made in various countries of the world and in many a revolutionary and war zone in this wonderful world, which is being made a fool of more and more by unreasonable, criminal, war and revolution-loving imbecilic creatures, for which they still believe that they should be praised and awarded medals and money. I am sorry that I cannot give you any sound advice, because if the donkey does not want to drink, it does not, it bucks, and on top of that, it strikes out. And it is not just the Arabs and the Israelis who are behaving in this wise, but also the British and the Northern Irish, the Taliban in Afghanistan, the Americans, who are interfering everywhere, as NATO has been doing for some time. But also the Serbs, Albanians, and Macedonians, as well as the Iraqis and Iranians and many others. They all promote only war and terrorism, but not peace, love and freedom, because their inexcusable actions of naked, evil violence again generate new naked and evil gay vault, see meaning above, as well as hatred and emotions of revenge, which leads to constant new bloodshed, murder and manslaughter, for which there is no excuse whatsoever, because everything mocks humanity and the reverence for life, and therefore everything is also beneath the dignity of being human, of love, justice, freedom, and peace. Very often there are religious fanatical ideas, thoughts, feelings and emotions which lead to the mutual slaughter, murder and terrorization of the various groups, as is particularly the case in Ireland and the Balkans and in Afghanistan, etc. As a rule, the fanaticism and inhumanity are so crass, degenerate, bestial, and full of hatred that even innocent children and women are literally dehumanized, bloodthirstily and murderously, torturously massacred and slaughtered. And it is precisely them, the innocent women and children, who suffer the most from all this, because the warriors and murderers are addicted to the madness of playing warriors' games and to religious madness and laziness, and therefore prefer to murder and rape, etc., than to work. But there is no excuse for war and murder, nor for the abuse and rape of women and children, nor for torture and the death penalty. There is probably nothing more to be said, except that even the worst predator, even if it is degenerating, like a man-eater, does not kill, murder, massacre, and slaughter living beings in this immensely primitive blood. Rape, torture, delusion, hate, and vengeful, kind, and wise, as the Ausgartity, one who has gotten very badly out of control of the good human nature, human being does in relation to his or her own kind. Billy.
Reader's question.
Today, Billy's note, 11th of September 2001. These terrible terrorist attacks have occurred in America, which have probably claimed many thousands of lives, with more attacks to come. So it will certainly not be the destruction of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and the failed destruction of Camp Davis. Is there really nothing that can be done to eradicate terrorism that is spreading throughout the world? Terrorism is not a means of solving problems and creating peace. What is your opinion? Can you comment on this in one of your bulletins? Noldy Joseph, Switzerland reader's question.
I have been watching on television the thing about the terrorist attack in America, and I can hardly believe what happened. I am shocked. I wonder when finally something rational will be done against terrorism and it will be eradicated. There must be some possibility, because things cannot go on like this and get worse. Surely there must be some possibility of intervening by Gayvolt if no other possibility exists. Can you make your views on this clear in the next bulletin? Thank you very much. Franco Meda, Switzerland.
Answer.
I have received identical or similar questions as well as proposals for measures against terrorism from various countries. on which I hereby comment, it is easy to say that terrorism can be tackled by Gewalt, but it is worth considering the consequences. The rule is that violence begets violence, and consequently violence goes on and never ends. As everywhere where there is trafficking, wars, revolutions and insurrections, etc., the principle is that a counterattack is made in one fell swoop. Loosely based on the traditional words, as you do to me, so do I do to you, and whosoever sows violence and terror will reap violence and terror. Already in the question posed by Shimon Nusseibeh regarding the acts of terror in Israel and Palestine, I have taken a detailed stand on this subject, but as a result of the terrorist attacks in America, I am happy to say a few more words. Although here, too, I would like to keep out of politics and only express my neutral opinion. Basically, all terrorism of any kind violates all the rights of humans and of all peoples and humanity. Whether it be the terrorism of anarchist, religious, sectarian terrorist organizations, of private criminal or vengeful elements, etc., or by governments, the military and the secret services. And it is precisely in governmental, military, and secret service terms that a whole host of states engage in terrorist activity which makes a mockery of justice as much as it does of humanity. This terrorism often takes the form of certain countries interfering in the domestic and foreign policy affairs of other states where they have no business. In this form, governments are overthrown and replaced by others that are submissive to those who interfere. To this end, disagreeable governments are murdered, massacred, blown up, or otherwise killed. It is not uncommon for trains, ships, or aircraft to be taken over by terrorists and blown up and used as weapons, as the case in America proves. And this is not only limited to religious fanatic, sectarian fanatic, anarchist and criminal elements, but also applies to actions of this kind carried out by governments, military and secret services, especially when one state interferes in the interests of another, and in doing so commits terrorist acts itself, which are, however, concealed as necessary measures, as reasons for state security, acts of retaliation and self-defense, as well as peace, world and national security acts, etc., etc. It should be clear that this gives rise to already existing or newly emerging fanatical hatred and bloodthirsty feelings of revenge against the terrorists and aggressors, and that counterterrorism is thereby promoted and receives new fuel and explosives. Terrorism thus only ever fuels new terrorism because violence generates violence again. Terrorism is always a payback for something that has been done to the terrorist party, rightly or wrongly. This can be based on the mere fact that a state sympathizes with another state or protects it, supplies it with weapons or food, or otherwise assists it if this state receiving aid is at loggerheads with one or more others for whatever reason. And if a state acts as a world police force and takes the right to interfere in foreign states, or to place itself between two rival parties, or to favor one and disadvantage or fight the other, then terror is pre-programmed. Thus, hatred and vengeance are stirred up, resulting in murder, manslaughter, destruction and crimes, which usually result in suicidal fanaticism that transcends all limits of logic, humanity, and human dignity, as well as the possibility of finding even a tiny remnant of reason and rationality. If the question is, what can be done about terrorism, and that it must be eradicated, then I have to ask how something should be done about it. It is true that terrorism must be eradicated, but it certainly cannot be done by naked Gewalt, si gedeckt. And first and foremost, it must be said, the guilty governments, military and secret services, which also carry out terrorism, must also be eradicated. This also applies to the fanatics who are supposedly fighting for freedom or who, in an extremist form, want to make their religion or sect in fundamentalist form the only world religion or sect for which every murderous act is just as right and good for them as it is for those who act for purely criminal or private vengeance or governmental, military and secret service reasons, and bring hardship, death, destruction, annihilation, suffering, and misery to many states and to the whole of humanity. Actions of all kinds which claim human lives, cause destruction and annihilation are always terrorist in any case. If these actions do not correspond to a self-defense and therefore not to a life and national defense, but are of offensive nature, no matter whether they are carried out by religions and sects, by terrorist organizations, criminals, private, vindictive, and jealous ones, governments, military, or secret organizations of state or private organizational form. Terror produces counter-terror, and naked gay vault thus produces naked gay vault again. Therefore, the rule is, whoever commits gay vault or terror, or any other crime or injustice, will one day be presented with a reckoning in some form or another. Therefore, no state and no human being need be surprised when they are met with gavolt, terror, some other crime, or simply something unjust has emanated from its side in equal measure. That is my opinion, my cognition and cognizance, my knowledge, my experience, my living of it, and my certainty. Billy.
Reader's question.
The terrorist attack in America upsets me to such an extent that I am willing to lead a counterstrike on my own by blowing up Arab consulates and embassies. I have the necessary means, such as explosives, remote detonators, etc. I think that this would be a just enterprise and an appropriate retaliation for the cowardly terrorist attack. What do you think, Billy Meyer, that at least some of the terrorist attack could be avenged? Ptaah, Switzerland?
Answer.
Already on the telephone, I explained to you that you should refrain from such actions because gay vault creates gay vault again, and terror creates terror again. So, if you do what you are supposing to do, despite my advice to the contrary, you are no better than the terrorists and those governments, military and secret services who also carry out terrorist acts and claim that it is for their own land's protection, for the national and human security, etc. Please read the questions and answers preceding your question, which also deal with terrorism. Think about what I have listed as my opinion in the answers, and that it is never worth retaliating for anything evil, even if it involves gay vault and terrorism. Make an effort to put your thoughts and feelings, as well as your emotions and your opinions, in order and try to find a solution for yourself that will take you away from the idea of retaliation, which can really be described as crazy and illogical and vindictive. Try, as all terrorists, governments, military and secret services should do, to find a possibility to find a peaceful solution that alone can lead to peaceful coexistence, both within yourself, between your feelings of hatred and revenge and your rationality, and equally between the fallible military, secret services, and private vindictive and religious or sectarian terrorists. Please also consider fundamentally that the Arab consulates and embassies you want to blow up are certainly not involved in any wise in the terrorist events in America, because it is to be assumed that not any Arab states are behind the thing, but any hateful and vengeful terrorist organization of non-state form. So if you were to put your plan into practice, you would be doing wrong simply because you would be harming innocent humans, quite apart from the fact that you too would be nothing more than a terrorist murderer. But you have promised me that you will wait for my reply in one of my next bulletins to read what I have to tell you about my opinion. And what has been said here is now my opinion, which you should also adhere to, which I am sure your common sense will suggest to you, if you let it prevail and think carefully about everything, for which I would be very grateful. The fact is that what the terrorists and those governments, the military, the secret services, private avengers and religious and sectarian fanatics are constantly and increasingly causing throughout the world is already enough suffering and grief, murder and manslaughter, and destruction and annihilation, so there is no need for another madman and idiot to step into the breach. And a madman and idiot you would indeed be if you were to put your certainly ill-considered, illogical, and feeble-minded idea into practice. Whoever the guilty parties are who committed the act of terrorism in America, they will sooner or later have to put their own skin on the market, if only because not only the vengeful Americans, but other states and those who stand by them will also hunt them down and eliminate them in a terrorist manner, sowing bloodshed and new fanatical hatred and greedy revenge, which in turn will lead to counterterrorism, which in turn will be repaid with counterterrorism or retaliatory terror. And so it will go on and on. Gavault follows Gavault, terror follows terror, murder and manslaughter follows murder and manslaughter, and destruction follows destruction. Neither the one nor the other will give in and become rational, because rationality, peace, freedom, and love are not in demand among the weapon-wielding, mightful, might-hungry, religious, and sectarian fanatics, for whom terrorism is a welcome means of enforcing their inhuman and feeble-minded plans. And those who are to be counted among them make themselves big with stupid and primitive sayings and words, which speak of the fact that every attack of any kind, every act of terrorism and every injury, etc., cries out for revenge, and can only be answered by such an act, but not by a reasonable yielding, peaceful, logical, and reasonable negotiation, from which at least a peaceful coexistence could emerge, from which in time a peaceful and free coexistence, and finally true peace and true freedom as well as true love among human beings could arise. This is not what is being sought. However, because each party is adamant about its positions and is in no wise prepared to make compromises from which peaceful coexistence and coexistence could gradually develop, both in political and religious terms. The condition, however, must be that all Ausartungen, all forms of getting very badly out of control of the good human nature, of religions and sects which harass those of other faiths or even persecute them with murder and manslaughter, etc., in any wise be eradicated. But now you, P.A., will please reconsider my words and use clear logical rationality. Besides, I have to tell you, should you nevertheless put your crazy plan into action, then you will create a state of conscience for yourself which you will certainly not be able to bear in the long run. The consequence of this will be that not only your conscience, but also your thoughts and feelings, and therefore your psyche, will go crazy and make you ill. Because I do not suppose, and you did not sound like this on the telephone, that you are an inane religious or sectarian fanatic who is no longer capable of any kind of rationality or logic. Furthermore, and you must also take this into account, if you were a damn terrorist, you would be hunted down by law and certainly caught, which would inevitably bring you to a legal conviction. Remember, only those who do right can live right. In this sense, I hope that you will use rationality and get rid of your insane thoughts. Behave like a decent and honorable citizen and a worthy human being. Renounce feelings of hatred and revenge. Neither destroy or annihilate any material things, and do not harm the life and limb of people. Billy.
Another word.
What more needs to be said about terrorism, acts of Gavault and assassinations? Those who commit terrorism, acts of Gavault and assassinations, etc., who interfere in foreign countries, whoever they are, whether individuals, organizations, or states with their governments, military and intelligence services, they do not care in any wise about all the misery, grief, disaster, destruction, and annihilation, as well as the roaring suffering and misery they cause, but they are still rejoicing about it, shouting pro and hooray and touting it, but when it hits them themselves and they are presented with a reckoning for their own similar actions, then at least they feel and think they are innocently attacked, even if they themselves have already brought death, destruction, ruin, and annihilation to the world tens of thousands or even millions of times. And if it really hits them themselves, then the great screaming, howling, and gnashing of teeth begins with them. But only moments later, all fear, shock, and horror disappears to make room for the rising, boundless, and fanatical hatred and the infernal vindictiveness and retaliation. In addition, the world takes sides with those with whom it sympathizes and supports them with every possible help for further injustice and inhuman acts of terror. When further and new disaster, bloodshed, misery, suffering, and new destruction and annihilation are caused by counterterrorism. And what is not asked is how much suffering, distress, grief, misery, destruction, and annihilation they have already caused around the world or in any of the places they sympathize with. Of course, everything that is caused by degenerated religious fundamentalism, by other religious fanatical madness, as well as by right-wing extremism and by state military and secret service terrorist machinations, which claims more and more innocent human lives, is terrible and horrible. But all this in no wise justifies carrying out counter-terrorist acts, etc., with similar means, and possibly in an even worse form, and again claiming countless innocent human lives. Such actions promote hatred and fanaticism, as well as feelings of revenge more and more, and instead of something improving, everything only gets worse and more out of control. So there is also no excuse whatsoever for one party or the other, and certainly not for acts of terror and violence as well as assassinations. Counter-terror, acts of hatred and revenge and retaliatory measures as self-defense, because in any case, such an act can only ever take place when an acutely occurring attack has to be averted. But if an act or an attack has already taken place, then there is no longer any self-defense, and consequently only the possibility of just punishment is given, which, however, is to be carried out in any case in a logical, humane form that is worthy of life. This means, however, that the guilty should not be killed or murdered, but should be subjected to an appropriate punishment, which, in the worst case, should be carried out in lifelong separation from society and in complete isolation from it, according to a certain yet logical and humane principle. What certainly still needs to be said and explained is this: those who carry out assassination attempts exalt, sanctify, and practice gavalt and terror, as well as political, religious, sectarian, secret service, and military special forces, who act murderously and unpredictably out of false and sick, fanatical, hateful, and vengeful, as well as retaliatorily irrational, unlogical, and human contemptuous attitude, and out of sick thoughts and feelings, are aggrieved. They are all wretched creatures without any conscience and without human worthiness, and they can and must never be equated with the honest citizens of the states from which the perpetrators of Gewalt and assassinations, as well as terrorists, fanatical haters of race and other faiths, as well as the politically aberrated, etc., are recruited. The normal citizens of any state can never be equated with these degenerates if they do not cooperate with these humanity-crushing rabble and lend them a hand and tolerate or endorse their deeds. Faith is also irrelevant in this respect if it does not degenerate fanatically and does not give rise to infernal hatred and bestial and bloodthirsty vengefulness and retaliation. It is wrong to think, feel, and act in such a fashion that those of other faiths are ostracized, persecuted, harassed, assaulted or tortured, injured, or killed, simply because they belong to the faith of those from whom the degenerate criminals, assassins, felons, terrorists, fanatical religious fundamentalists, sectarians, and other despicable creatures originate. Likewise, it is wrong and unjust if humans are harassed in the aforementioned form, just because they are nationals of countries from which the criminal, felonious and terrorist scum originate, which, however, despite their inhumanity and human lack of dignity, also consist of human beings. Consequently, they should not be dealt with in the same form through retaliatory measures and acts of terror, and thus, like should not be repaid with like. In truth, a way must be found for them that is humane and just, in that they should not also be murdered by terror and the like, but should only be segregated from human society for life, in order to provide for their livelihood through hard work with their hands, without luxury and the like, but provided with all the necessary teachings to change their mind and become human beings. Only in this form is it possible for them to become aware of their guilt and to learn and become worthy of life under the burden of their troubled conscience. Billy.
Reader's question.
Mr. Mayor, I am sorry to call you on an anonymous basis. I'm a diligent reader of your website where a lot of interesting, logical and clarifying information is to be found. As a rule, I can agree with what you publish, except that you have no political opinion that would be of significance, particularly with regard to the attacks of September 11 in America. However, it would be a pleasure for me, and certainly also important for the human beings, if you would nevertheless refrain from your rule in this respect, and express your opinion on it. T. Bayer, Switzerland.
Answer.
Already on the telephone I explained to you that I am not involved in political activities and that I cannot give an answer in this form in the bulletin. Nevertheless, I can express myself without being politically active, but simply to express my opinion according to the experiences and lessons I have learned in many countries around the world, and therefore also according to how I see, understand, and judge the matter. And precisely in this sense I must agree with what you have said. My opinion on this is that the Americans themselves have caused a great deal of harm, both to the Indians and through terrorist training, which they simply call resistance fighter training, as well as interference in the affairs of many foreign states and groups, as a result of which countless people have lost their lives. That too, in my view, amounts to terrorism and so on. Americans have for decades, apart from the Indian massacres, slavery and various other atrocious things of the past centuries, committed acts of violence all over the world, including in Vietnam and in Islamic countries, etc., for which they had to reckon that one day they would be presented with the bill for this, which unfortunately happened in a very terrible form on September 11, 2001, with the acts of terrorism on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon, and the fortunately unsuccessful assassination attempt on Camp David. Of course, the whole event cannot be justified in any wise, quite the opposite. And it is extremely terrible that many innocent people have lost their lives in the process. But what is the conclusion of the whole thing? A president of state who, as is repeatedly made public, is not quite the brightest in the colonel's chamber, and who is obviously not quite in his right mind either, cries out and screams for hatred and revenge in order to incite the Senate, the Congress, and the people to war and retaliation, on account of which the Senate and the Congress also promised him $40,040,000 to wage war against the terrorists worldwide, but by which he also means the states from which the terrorists were born or where they are or have been. The fact that in the process inhumane things are happening again, that masses of innocent blood are being shed and renewed hatred and terrorism, revenge, retaliation and madness are being brought about, is just as little of a concern to this man as to those in the Senate and the people who are shouting pro and hooray for infernal hatred and bloodthirsty revenge and retaliation. Only a small part of perhaps 30% of the entire American and the rest of the world population thinks differently, logically, rationally, and humanely. But how must all these people be stupid and foolish, clamoring for hatred, revenge, retribution, and global war? And where is their humanity when they behave worse than degenerate, bloodthirsty beasts? It is all well and good and only justice if the guilty are asked to pay and are punished suitably, but not again with bloodshed and death, if it can be done differently. The guilty must be collected and brought to a just judgment, which does not, however, threaten death, but which is directed towards a punishment that corresponds to the true dignity of humans, and which gives the guilty the opportunity to get away from their misguided and wrong thinking and, therefore, to learn so that they may finally become human and rational beings after all, to whom respect may be paid. But this is not possible as long as one simply mindlessly follows the cries of the superiors and those who cry out for hatred, revenge and retribution, and accept a worldwide and therefore Third World War, which is finally triggered off by a single man, whose face is written with the inability to govern a state, and who is quite obviously no more attached to clear reason than he is to rationality and wisdom, because his head somehow seems to be hollow and without rationality. It must also be said that there is no rationality at all when whole states and their innocent population are harassed, attacked, bombed, and effectively bumped off and have to pay for harboring terrorists or for being citizens there. It also lacks all rationality when people of different faiths have to suffer the same fate, for the very reason that their faith does not correspond to the norm of what the irrational xenophobes and racial haters expect of them. Therefore, if guilty people must be sought, then in any case it must always be only those who are really guilty and with whom the state and the people have nothing to do, except those who proclaim their support for terrorism, whether it is carried out by private individuals or organized terrorists or by state, military and secret service terrorism. What has been said is my opinion, and it really has nothing to do with politics, but only with common sense, with reason, with human dignity, humanity, and justice, and with respect for life and the hope that the American Senate and the American people will begin to think and act in a fashion that is worthy of life, at least all those whom it concerns and who are currently still shouting for and cheering for hatred, revenge, and retribution. The Senate and the people must change their minds and stop the madness of their irresponsibly retaliatory and apparently senseless president before he sets off a third world conflagration through his deranged senses, driving all of humanity to death and ruin and ultimately the planet lying in rubble and ashes. To help a state and people to carry out worldwide hateful, vindictive, and unreasonably retaliatory acts of terrorism, and possibly even to provoke a third world war, is to be classified in the realm of terrorism, just as much as the terrorists or the state and the humanity itself. That full of hatred and vengeance as well as irrationality and inhumanity, commit attacks and similar crimes and thereby murders many innocent people who are not involved in the cause. It must therefore be the duty of every state and human to speak out against this madness, to expose the true facts, to refuse any help for further terrorism, instead of showing solidarity with those who hate, seek revenge and retaliate, whether they are purely private or organized, or whether they come from governments, any military and its special units, or from intelligence services. Anyone who shakes hands with a terrorist act and provides assistance is guilty of terrorism, even if it comes from a government. Billy?
What I think about terror and retaliation.
War, assassinations, hatred, revenge, retaliation, and other terror are never ways and means to fight the same with the same, to atone for injustice murder and manslaughter, as well as massacres and other inhumanities, or to create justice and peace, because to retaliate terror with counter-terror means new war and new assassinations and retaliation, as well as new revenge and other new terror. There is only one way to achieve justice and peace, and that is through peaceful reason, charity, humanity, equality of all human beings as such, regardless of race and creed. But this also refers to the punishment of the guilty who violate all the rights of human beings and of being human and terrorize life itself with infernal and dehumanized behavior. In any case, the guilty must not be brought to justice and condemned by equally terrorist means directed against innocent people, but only by means that are directed only and in any case solely towards the guilty. These means, however, should and must also be just and humane and only lethal in genuine self-defense. Judgment and punishment, when the guilty are caught, should be humane, just, and proportionate, but never punishable by death. For the death penalty also means terror, hatred, revenge, and bloody retribution, and those who advocate this or carry it out themselves are no better than the human-despising, inhumane, brutal, and inhuman terrorists and murder-planning ones themselves.
And what I think in terms of faith and those of other faiths.
For my part, I tolerate every faith as such, but not its injustices and inhuman degenerations, which are expressed, for example, through fanaticism and ritual acts in bloody and murderous or suicidal forms, actions and machinations, etc., but I never take a stand against or despise people of other faiths for the sake of pure faith, because love for my fellow man is very important to me, as is respect for his opinion, his faith, and his life, regardless of whether he or she is a Christian, Muslim, Jew, Hindu, or Buddhist, or whether they belong to any sect. So I never reject that which is foreign, but I respect and honor it, and always, and in every case, try to understand it and to recognize its value, and exactly this also refers to every single person, no matter whether they are strangers or known to me, and therefore also no matter which denomination, political or worldly train of thought they follow, as well as which social class they belong to. I can also say with certainty that I am never racist in any wise, nor am I ever willing to get involved in any such form. Furthermore, I am neutral in my thoughts as well as in my feelings, which also allows me to always give my free and honest opinion in every respect, even if it does not suit some of my contemporaries, when I denounce their rotten or criminal machinations by simply stating the existing facts, which nobody else dares to talk about openly. Billy.
Your answers in the bulletin are entirely in line with all of us. Terrorism must be fought. That is not a question, but terrorism must not be answered with counter-terrorism. And what the avenging ones in Afghanistan are doing can clearly be placed in the realm of counter-terrorism, which is based on hatred, revenge, and bloody retribution. If terrorist acts are to be punished, then this must never be done on the backs of and to the detriment of innocent people, but must be handled in such a manner that only the terrorist elements are targeted for punishment. This can be done in a peaceful form by negotiating with those governments, etc., in whose realm the criminals and therefore the terrorists are located. But if this is not possible because, like the Taliban in Afghanistan, the rulers themselves are criminal and terrorist, then other measures must be taken to ensure that the culprits are tracked down and brought to justice by appropriate and possibly secret companies, without harming innocent people, and just as innocently terrorizing an entire people and inflicting murder and destruction on them as the U.S. aggressors are doing in Afghanistan, and not caring that many innocent women, children, and men lose their lives. This is neither the art of correctness, nor is it in accordance with humanity, because truthfully everything points to the fact that an arrogant self-righteousness and self-importance as well as hatred, retaliation and vindictiveness lead the scepter in the worst form and show absolutely no value for the aggressor's human lives.
You speak for me. But what I also think is that the entire Islamic world is also being attacked with the counter-terrorist machinations in Afghanistan, because even if it is explained quite differently, the whole thing is also a murderous and dangerous war against Islam. With the acts of war, the Islamic faith and the Islam religion are also being attacked, and thus all humans who belong to the Islamic denomination. This fact remains, even if it is presented differently by unreasonable ones who claim that only terrorism and not Islam is being fought. So the whole thing is not only to be placed in the realm of counter-terrorism, but also in the realm of a new religious war, which may ultimately degenerate into a worldwide catastrophe, namely the Third World War. Although this is not to be hoped for, the possibility does exist. It is simply criminal to act in this manner. The history of humanity alone proves the devastating consequences of all the religious wars and religious fanaticism of the past 2,000 years. With the allegedly so peaceful Christians causing so much disaster, committing murders and robbing people and nations with their crusades and the Inquisition, as no other religion has ever done before. One thinks also of America, when there, under the command of Christopher Columbus, the Europeans broke in a religiously fanatical form and bestially raged among the natives and robbed their treasures. And one thinks of the Americans, who proceeded unrestrainedly against the Indians and exterminated them almost as the English did the natives there in Tasmania. And just think of the American Ku Klux Klan, who tortured and murdered black people in a Christian sectarian fanaticism, but also radical Republicans. Looting, flogging, and femicide were the order of the day. This was done by the first terrorist Ku Klux Klan organization, which was founded in Pulaski, Tennessee, USA in 1866, and whose goal was to maintain the colonial way of life in the American southern states. The secret society, however, which consisted of white farmers and had an order-like structure and corresponding rituals and symbols, such as the flame cross and the white robe with pointed hood, only existed in this form until 1869 and 1871, respectively, after which it was continued near Atlanta in 1915. This new Ku Klux Klan was only externally linked to its old predecessor, and persecuted intellectuals, as well as racial, religious, and ethnic minorities. Especially blacks, Catholics, Jews, and Irish, etc., have been among the victims of the new Ku Klux Klan ever since. However, the greatest influence of the Klan was in 1924-25, when it had between 4 and 5 million members. The secret society was also a vehement opponent of the workers' organizations and prohibition. The Klan's influence diminished during the Great Depression, especially with the transformation of America after 1929, which accompanied the crisis. Since 1928, the Klan was officially no longer a secret society. In the 1960s, however, it became popular again. It should still be said that despite the vain attempt to enforce civil rights laws by force in the South of America, the Ku Klux Klan still exists today as a small militant group, although it still has several thousand members. Some of them have come into contact with neo-Nazi and right-wing extremist organizations, which are causing a great deal of harm in America, Germany, and other countries in terrorist and anarchist forms. So there are also connections with the terrorists of the Al-Qaeda group and other terrorist organizations around the world, as you recently explained to me. Then there is also the fact that the Americans sent out slave ships and kidnapped black people in Africa, took them to America, and kept them as slaves under such inhuman conditions and treatment that even today we have to talk about a human catastrophe in this respect. This is quite apart from what the Americans did in Vietnam and when they razed the medical city of Dresden to the ground during the Second World War, as well as Schweinfurt and so on. When I think about all these events, I think that all this has to do with pure, sheer terror, which is now being continued in Afghanistan, and which is still finding many pro and cheering supporters all over the world. And it is precisely on this point that I think that everyone, whether private individuals, the military, governments, etc., who agree with these acts of terror, who support and praise them, is no better than the terrorists themselves, and therefore no better than those who practice counter-terrorism. In thoughts of hate, revenge and retaliation, and therefore also in counter-terrorism, humans think only of themselves, of their own well-being, money, happiness, and life, but not of the same things in relation to innocent fellow human beings who are murdered as a result of terror. And counter-terrorism, and as a result of untamed hate and the desire for revenge and retaliation. In truth, no honest human may think only for themselves and live for themselves alone, but it is his or her damned duty and obligation that they also take care of the life and the good and woe of his or her neighbor. And consequently they must also avoid that thoughts and feelings of hatred, revenge, and retribution, and actions arise through which innocent people are harmed, or even lose their lives. In fact, there is never a reason for war, because every dispute, as well as all inconsistencies, misunderstandings, claims, punitive measures, and whatever else, can be solved in a different, human, humane, and peaceful fashion, or at least in a manner that does not bring harm or death to human beings. There are enough authoritative forms for this. If only reason prevails and not self-importance, lust for power, extremism, hatred, revenge and retaliation, as well as terrorism and arrogance, etc., are brought to bear. Violence, however, produces violence again, terrorism again terrorism, and war again war, etc., etc. And those who howl with the wolves are no better than the wolves themselves.
These are good words, which also correspond to my meaning. You should publish them on the internet, even though it can be very dangerous for you. But there would be the possibility that one or the other person who reads your words then would have a different sense when he or she thinks about everything thoroughly. And what you say is not to be classified as a political form, for it is only existing facts that you call by their word, so you do not do anything wrong and do not engage in political activity. But now, dear friend, I really have no more time because I have to do my duties, which I cannot postpone any further. Unfortunately, your presentation took up more time than I had expected. Goodbye.
Take care, then. Sorry for my long speech, but it had to be said.